To introduce today Professor Hugh White, head of the Strategic and Defense Studies Center within our School of International Political and Strategic Studies, as well as a visiting fellow at the Lowy Institute for International Policy, and of course a leading figure in the fields of Australian strategic and defense policy, Asia-Pacific strategic issues, and global strategic affairs as they affect Australia. Hugh's first passion was philosophy, which he studied in the 1970s at Melbourne and Oxford universities. But over the past 30 years or so, a little less than 30 perhaps, Hugh, he has devoted his attention to strategic and defense studies as an intelligence analyst with the Office of National Assessments, as a journalist with the Sydney Morning Herald, as a personal advisor to Defense Minister Kim Beazley and Prime Minister Bob Hawke, as a senior public servant in the capacity of Deputy Secretary for Strategy and Intelligence in the Department of Defense from 1995 to 2000, and principal author of the 2000 Defense White Paper, as a policy scholar serving as the first director of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute from 2001 to 2004, and now as an academic, currently professor of strategic studies here at the ANU, and, I might add, a wonderful colleague from whom I always learn a great deal. That is indeed our objective today, to learn a great deal once again from Professor White as he delivers this public lecture entitled, "Abandon the Alliance: How China's Rise Will Shape Australia's Future." Hugh.
Well, thank you very much, Paul, for that very kind introduction. It's an interesting reflection on the business of academic politics that the person charged with running our school should find strategic advice even remotely useful. But it is really a pleasure to work with Paul in the big changes we've been making in the College of Asia and the Pacific, and in our school in particular over the last year or so. It's been a real pleasure. So thanks very much for the introduction, and thanks to Katrina and Martin and her team at the press office for bringing this together, and for Francis to making it all happen, and of course to you all for coming along. I really appreciate it. Well, we've been living through some turbulent political times, and that turbulence raises a lot of questions, but one, I think, in particular that's worth reflecting on, and that is, what should we expect of our leaders? What should we expect of our political leaders? What kind of service should they be delivering to us? And it's, I would argue, not just running the shop day by day. There is a fair bit to government. It's just running the shop. You know, issues turn up day by day, week by week, they've got to be dealt with. But we do expect more of our leaders than that. We do expect them not just to run the shop day by day, but to think about the long-term business, to think about where the business of this country is going to be 10 years or 20 years or even 30 years ahead. See how the world is changing, see what new opportunities there are, what things that might not have worked in the past that might work in future, and see what the risks are, see what has worked in the past that might not work in the future. And having seen that, act before it's too late to shape Australia's approach to the world. Before it's too late to try and shape outcomes that suit us well. Act to the point where we don't just have to accept, so to speak, what happens to us. And that means, of course, that we have to expect them to work in advance of things becoming absolutely clear. They have to work through the fog of the future. Now, one of the most decisive things about Kevin Rudd's candidacy as Prime Minister, and the promise he offered, was that he would do this look into the future. I mean, all politicians promise to do it, but one of the things about the Rudd candidacy was that he seemed a person who was seriously committed and well equipped to do more than mind the shop, to look into the future and help us to shape the kind of future we wanted. But I think there's some hesitation about whether he actually achieved that. And my reading, at least, of the atmosphere of the recent election campaign is that very few of us thought that either of the leaders on offer or offering us much of that at the moment. Julia Gillard asked about, a couple of days ago by Peter Harcher at the Sydney Morning Herald, asked about, in the connection with my quarterly essay, about the future of our alliance with the United States in the light of the rise of China. Assured him, according to Peter's quote, "There is no rethinking our alliance with the United States. Full stop." Well, my aim this evening is to explain why, if she values the alliance, and I'm sure she does, she should rethink it. She should see that the circumstances in which the alliance works, the circumstances that determine the extent to which the alliance works for us and how it works for us, are changing very rapidly, and I think very profoundly, and the alliance must therefore change too. In fact, I will argue that the circumstances are changing so radically that there is a possibility that in future the alliance might not work for Australia. And that shows to me just how important it is to make sure that those circumstances, the circumstances in which the alliance would not work for Australia, don't arise. Now, the fact that I even raise that possibility, that there could be circumstances in which the alliance doesn't work for us, the fact that I even raise that possibility commits me to a view of the alliance which some people will not accept. There are, broadly speaking, two views of the alliance out there in the debate. The first views of the alliance as policy. What's policy? Well, J.F. Kennedy, one of my heroes, once said in answer to a question like that, well, if it works and it lasts, then it's policy. And it's not a bad principle. Well, the alliance has worked, I would argue, worked very well for Australia, and it's lasted. It's lasted a long time. But the idea of seeing the alliance as policy presupposes that if it ceases working, it won't last and it shouldn't last. And what's embedded in that is the idea that, important though the alliance is, it is in the end a means, not an end in itself. And that whether the alliance should last as a policy, whether it works for us, should be subjected to the test of whether it actually delivers on Australia's national interests. The alliance is subordinate to our national interests. But there is another view of the alliance, what one might call alliance as identity. This view of the alliance is that the alliance is not subordinate to anything. It's not subordinate to a conception of our interests. It's not subject to a kind of an instrumental assessment as to whether it works for us or not. It's not a matter of it working for us, it is us. The alliance is part of what we are, and it's part of what being an Australian means. Now, both these views of the alliance are quite common in the way we talk about the alliance. Most of us talk about the alliance most of the time, and they're quite common in the way governments talk about the alliance. Governments, ministers, actually use both of these frames, both of these formula, at different times when they're talking about the alliance. They tend to use the first one, the alliance's policy, when they're talking at home in Australia and when they're talking amongst themselves within government. They tend to use the second model, the alliance as identity, when they're in the US, not surprisingly, or when they've got US friends and guests, and when they're talking in public more broadly. Now, one of the reasons why the idea of alliance as identity has a relatively, one might even say, a very strong grip on the Australian public imagination, on the way we think of the alliance, is that our first alliance, and I like the prototype for the US alliance we have today, was, of course, our alliance, I put that in inverted commas, with Britain, which really was part of our identity to start with. A very important part of the history of the 20th century was Australia moving from an identification of our relationship with the United Kingdom as an alliance of identity. Simply, we were part of the empire, and the empire was what we were, to a recognition that actually that alliance didn't work that way. Singapore in 1942 was a pretty important data point on that process, but it was actually a long and complicated process of us emancipating ourselves from the idea that the alliance with Britain was part of our identity and starting to see the alliance as a policy construct, and almost as soon as we got there, it disappeared. Actually, thanks to British decisions, not ours. But that thought didn't entirely die with the with the British. It's lived on, as I say, as part of our approach to the US alliance. And in a sense, it's almost strengthened in the last few years as the talk of the Anglosphere has returned. The idea of the Anglosphere, the idea that there's an alliance of English-speaking countries, rugby-playing countries, people sometimes call them, that somehow do the world's hard work, and that what brings them together is their Englishness, their English-speakingness anyway. I think one of the reasons why that attracted a fair bit of attention, and significant national figures, including Tony Abbott, paid a lot of attention, is that it does kind of draw us back to that image of an alliance of identity. Well, I don't want to go on about it, or I think it's a very interesting subject in itself. I'm just here to tell you I'm not in the alliance as identity camp. I'm an alliance as policy man. I've worked with the alliance all my professional life. I've always argued that the alliance works very well for Australia. I don't think anyone could be a more enthusiastic supporter of the alliance as policy than me, but I do see it as a policy. I think the idea of alliance as identity is incompatible with a robust vision of Australian nationhood, and it assumes an identity of interests which I think simply does not exist. And even if it did exist, it is not reciprocated, and nor should it be reciprocated. Why should we ask the United States to regard their interests as identical to ours? Because we're not them. And this proposition that we have an alliance of interest rather than identity is not just a statement, what you might call sort of vaguely lefty, sort of cheap Australian pseudo-nationalism. It's a judgment of fact about the independence of our two states and what that means for our separate and potentially divergent interests. So for me, it is thinkable that in different circumstances, very different circumstances, the alliance with the United States might not serve our interests. I can imagine that happening. And if our political leaders don't, or if some of our political leaders don't agree with that, I'm very interested in them saying so. If it is the case that the possibility of us rethinking the alliance is off the table because there are no circumstances in which we can imagine that would happen, then I think we ought to be told. Because I don't actually think in the end that's a vision. It's a vision they're very keen to allude to, but I don't think it's actually a vision that any of them seriously hold. Now this point is important because our strategic circumstances today are changing very fast, and the possibility that they're changing fast enough and far enough that a situation might arise in which the alliance doesn't serve our interests is with us on the policy horizon, perhaps closer than the policy horizon, more vividly than it has been for a very long time. I won't say than at any time in our history, than for a very long time, certainly in the time of the professional lifetimes of anybody now active in the public policy debate or in the public policy business. I think you'd have to go back at least 40 years to the post-Vietnam turbulence to get a time where these issues were as much on the table because of the way our strategic circumstances are changing. And of course, the key to that, what drives that very significant set of changes, is China's economic growth. It's a big subject. Let me just throw a few propositions on the table. If China grows for the next 30 years, it will overtake, at the way it's grown for the last 30 years, it will overtake the United States to become the biggest economy in the world. That is a fact which is simultaneously familiar and almost unbelievable. We almost can't imagine a world in which the United States is not the strongest country in the world. And one of the difficulties we have with this issue is wrestling with the remarkableness of what is, in a sense, a rather mundane fact. Now, of course, it might not keep growing, but I think on balance China probably will. And if it does, then I think it will mark one of the most fundamental changes in Australia's strategic situation in our history, quite possibly the most fundamental, certainly one of the three most fundamental we've faced. Now, what's striking about the Australian attitude to this remarkable transformation in our situation is that all of us not only expect but hope it will happen, because our only model for Australia's economic future is that China keeps growing and keeps buying more and more of our stuff and hopefully pays higher and higher prices and keeps the kind of economic prosperity which has been so good for Australia over the last few decades, running for the next few decades. And as I say, that's the only model for our economic future we've got. I haven't heard of any others. So our vision of our future economically fundamentally depends on China doing that. But at the same time, we turn a blind eye to the political and strategic consequences of that fact. We assume that China's economy can grow to overtake America's without changing the political and strategic relationship between the US and China, without changing the way Asia works politically and strategically, and without changing the fundamental circumstances which govern our US alliance and whether the US alliance works for us. Those sets of blindnesses, if I can put it that way, overlook the fundamental relationship between wealth and power. They overlook how the relationship between great powers shape the world the rest of us live in. And they overlook how deeply our alliance and whether it works for us depends on the strategic context in which we operate. Now, the core argument of my quarterly essay that starts with that observation about China's economic growth is simply this: that its growth transforms Asia politically and strategically, and not because of America's weakness, but because of China's strength. This is not an argument about American decline. Even if America was growing like mad, even if it was not in Iraq, was not in Afghanistan, didn't have a huge debt, didn't have a huge fiscal deficit, even if it was going gangbusters, China's growth would still be posing a fundamental challenge to America's place in Asia. Now, those changes are not necessarily threatening. That is, China's growing power does not threaten Australia directly, but they will change the way Asia works. And those changes carry very big risks if they're not well managed. Big risks for Asia and big risks for Australia. Managing and minimising those risks will require very different approaches to regional diplomacy by everybody, by China, by America, by Japan and India, by the middle powers, including by Australia, than we've used in the past. And that we need to start taking those new approaches now, because this is not an issue that might arise sometime in the future. China is already a very substantial strategic competitor to the United States. It's already stronger relative to the United States economically than the Soviet Union ever was during the Cold War. It's already the second biggest economy in the world. It might be as little as 2 decades before China overtakes the United States. 2 decades is a very short period of time in this business. And from Australia's point of view, we need to start thinking about how we can help to build an Asia that best responds to the resulting tensions, and what we need to do if Asia doesn't respond effectively, can't build a new order that accommodates China's growing power and finds itself in a more contested strategic situation. Now, the best way to understand the nature of that challenge is to just spend a second talking about how we got where we are today. Because the most important thing about Asia today is that we sit at the end of, or at least we've evolved to where we are as a result of, not to prejudge the future history, 40 years of uncontested primacy by the United States. For 40 years, since Nixon went to China in 1972, the United States has been accepted in Asia, in particular by China and Japan, as the leading power. There has been a remarkable absence of strategic competition, and it is that which has made Asia so peaceful, so stable, so prosperous, has allowed integration, has allowed the evolution of political institutions, and so on. And right at the heart of that was a deal whereby China, when Nixon went to China, it was a deal whereby China accepted America as the dominant power in Asia, which was a tough thing for China to do. The Americans had to do a tough deal as well. It was a tough deal on both sides. But it's not as though China ever welcomed American primacy. But it worked out that on balance, China's interests were best served by ceasing to contest America's position and taking advantage of the space that would give it to do, well, exactly what it's done. It was a pretty shrewd move on their part. And they have been very patient. But as China's power grows, the rationale for China continuing to accept American primacy as the foundation for the regional order in which they participate gets weaker and weaker, and it becomes harder and harder for them to accept. as their power approaches America, that they have to continue to function within a framework that they accepted 40 years ago. They want more power. How much more? Well, at one level we could say they want as much as they can get. But most of us do. That's not a comment about China, it's a comment about humanity. But we can also, I think, expect that their appetite for power will be moderated by fairly shrewd judgments about costs and risks. They want to maximise the amount of power they can acquire as their strength grows, but their appetite will be moderated by the recognition that if they reach for too much, they might end up paying a very high price for it. I don't doubt that they would like to replace America as Asia's leader, to acquire the kind of uncontested primacy in Asia that America's enjoyed for the last 40 years. And it's worth bearing in mind that for Australia, that is a fairly uncomfortable prospect. Greg Sheridan, my old mate, a few years ago now, back in the mid-1990s when Keating was still Prime Minister, in an interview with Keating, recorded him saying, I won't do the Keating accent, but you can imagine how it came out. Well, none of us want to live in China's orbit, do we? I think that's probably true of most Australians. We don't want to live in China's orbit the way we live in America's orbit. So that's something we want to avoid. And the good news for us, in a sense, is that China couldn't get that kind of sole leadership, couldn't establish its own primacy in Asia uncontested, because it would face Japan, and it probably would face the United States, and eventually it will face India. And we hope that the Chinese will reach the conclusion that contesting all of those guys for primacy would be too much like hard work. So we hope, and perhaps more than hope, encourage China to think that its appetite for more power would be best served, it would best strike the balance between how much more power it wants and how much it's prepared to pay, by aiming not for that kind of uncontested leadership, let alone for a kind of a battle for leadership, but to share power with the US, with Japan perhaps, tough ask, but perhaps possible, eventually with India as India grows. And I think the idea that China could be talked into accepting that as a model for its future role in Asia is one of the core things that I'm trying to argue for in my quarterly essay. And it is a question. Can we use this idea to build a new order in Asia which accommodates China's power without conceding primacy to it and without allowing ourselves to be driven into or to slide into real strategic competition and the risk of conflict? Well, I think we can. I think that is a credible model, but only on the basis that the US itself accepts a very different role in Asia from the role it's accepted hitherto. And not just the role it's had in the last 40 years, but the role it's had for 100 years or so. Now, what is that role? What is this model of Asia's future that the Chinese might accept as a minimum condition? What does it require of America? Well, it requires America to stick around, not to dominate Asia, but to participate as an equal partner in the kind of shared leadership that we're inviting China to join. We're saying to China, look, don't try and dominate the joint. Accept that you're going to be a very strong power, but not strong enough to dominate by yourself. So join a shared leadership where you all manage your interests with one another in a peaceful and amicable and sensible fashion. Now, that model of what America would do is still sees America being immensely influential in Asia, a very active engagement, and it will still, of course, have immense power to bring to bear. But it's here to balance, not to dominate. In Asia, to balance, not to dominate. There are some historical models of this kind of system, not very many. The best model, I think, is 19th century Europe, where, notwithstanding huge shifts in economic relativities, particularly as Germany rose and Russia rose to a certain extent, there was, for a while, for 100 years, from 1815 to 1914, there were some very spectacular wars, but there was no fundamental breakdown of the order. And it didn't stop Europe growing and growing rich and taking over the world. It was a very good century for Europe. I think a model like that is perhaps the best we can hope for in Asia. And it does fundamentally depend on America being able to redefine its role in those terms. But in my quarterly essay, I use a scary word to describe what that involves. I use the word surrender, and I used it advisedly. There was no part of my intention in drafting the quarterly essay to make this sound easier than I think it will be, because it's not going to be easy. I think the United States is going to find it very difficult to accept a role as an equal partner with China. But it's worth bearing in mind that when I say surrender, I don't mean surrender primacy to China. I don't mean surrender Asia to China. I mean surrender its primacy to join this kind of, to use the phrase, the term I use in my model, this concert of power model. And that concert, if it works well, does constrain China. It gives China more power, of course, but it also constrains China, because right at the heart of that group is a recognition that if anybody steps out of line, if anybody tries to break the understandings between those powers on which the group is based, they will face the united opposition of the other members. So it's treating China as an equal. It is not conceding leadership to China. In fact, it's the alternative, or one of the alternatives to conceding leadership to China. Even so, it's not a welcome idea. It is deeply contrary to a very deep image that Americans have of themselves, and I might say deeply contrary to a very important image that we have of America. There is a real question as to whether Americans can accept that the kind of compromise and sort of backroom dealing which is implicit in this kind of model of diplomacy is consistent with their model of themselves as an exceptional country, a country that doesn't do that kind of thing, a country that doesn't have to do that kind of thing. It doesn't have to negotiate about its interests, or it doesn't have to negotiate about its values. It's a very difficult challenge for America, because America has never actually worked in a strategic system like this before in its history, since it became an active international player, which it only did after it became the strongest country in the world. It's always aspired to, and very often achieved, the kind of primacy it exercises today. And one of the reasons why I think Americans will find this a very disconcerting idea is that it does sound so much like appeasement. Accommodating China so easily seems to slip into appeasing China. And we all know our history, and we all know that appeasement never works. In the essay, I address that issue in some detail. My core point is that appeasement does some work if it fails to embed a mechanism which draws lines and enforces lines. Chamberlain's big mistake in Munich was not that he refused to go to war with Germany to save the Sudetenland. Tough for the Sudeten, tough for the Czechs, but I frankly sympathise with Chamberlain for not going to war in 1938 to save Sudetenland. His mistake was not making it absolutely clear to Hitler that he couldn't take Poland, and not doing what was required to give substance to that by in particular building the alliance with the Soviet Union, which was kind of on offer at the time. So the trick with avoiding appeasement is not never to accommodate rising powers, but to be very clear what the limits of accommodation are, and to be very clear on the mechanisms which impose those limits. A concert of power model of the sort I'm talking about achieves that. Even so, it's not a comfortable model. It's not something anyone's going to be happy doing until they look at the alternatives. Because the alternatives to accommodating China in the way I'm describing, I think, are very stark. Look at them from America's point of view. Look at America's options. And I do think America faces choices of a kind of Euclidean clarity. It either shares power with China in the way I've been talking about, or it withdraws from Asia, or it contests with China for primacy. And of course, everyone will try and avoid that very stark set of choices, but I think it's very hard to avoid them. He's going to do one or other of those three. And don't rule out withdrawal. American leaders keep on saying that America is an Asian power and there's no way it's ever going to withdraw. But what they mean when they say that is we're never going to withdraw from an Asia in which we have uncontested primacy, and neither would I. Uncontested primacy is a doddle. The question is, does America still stay engaged in Asia if, in order to stay, it either has to share power with China, which it doesn't want to do, or it has to compete strategically with the second strongest country in the world? That's a very different choice. It's a choice Americans haven't faced, and I don't think it's a choice Americans have really got their head around. If America does withdraw, we will live in China's orbit, or we'll live in a region which is dominated, I would guess, by very intense strategic competition between China and Japan. It will be hard to build a stable concert of powers in Asia with America at the table. You take America away from the table, and the Chinese and the Japanese are looking at one another eyeball to eyeball across it. Well, just the evidence the last few days suggests how hard that would be. So withdrawal is one of the alternatives, and it's not a good one for Australia. And that's the one, by the way, that's one of the ones in which we do lose the alliance. We have no choice about it. If America is not strategically engaged in the Western Pacific, we're not an ally. The other alternative, of course, is to compete. Competing with China, I think, in a sense, is the default option for the United States. It carries huge economic costs because at a certain point of strategic competition, it becomes very hard to trade across the boundary. It also carries immense strategic risks. One doesn't want to be too melodramatic about this, but history suggests that strategic competition between the world's strongest and second strongest states are very hard to keep under control, and if they get away, they really get away in a big way. And these are nuclear-armed states. We don't have very much case law on what happens when nuclear-armed states compete strategically, but what we have is pretty scary. And I'm one of those who thinks that we got through the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union by the skin of our teeth. The more intense strategic competition between the US and China becomes, if that's the trajectory we follow, the higher the risk of a really catastrophic conflict in Asia, and the higher the risk that that conflict could go nuclear. This would become the most costly war in human history, quite fast. So that's a really high price to pay. You didn't like sharing with China? In a sense, neither do I much. But do I prefer it to withdrawing, to seeing the US withdraw? And do I prefer it to seeing the US compete with China? You bet. Now, some people will say, I'm being too gloomy, because why should the US and China compete? And in particular, how can they afford to compete? Because they have such immense economic stake in getting on well with one another. And they do. But I think it would be very unwise to assume that the economic costs to both sides of strategic competition means that strategic competition won't occur. If nations, and for that matter people, always behaved rationally, we could be very confident of that judgment. But that's not an assumption we can make. It's not a question as to whether anybody in Beijing or Washington, or for that matter Tokyo or Canberra, is dumb enough to want to see the US and China compete strategically, let alone go to war. It's whether they're smart enough to avoid it. It can be avoided. It can be avoided by adopting the kind of model that I've mentioned. But you have to adopt the kind of model I've mentioned to avoid it. If the US doesn't share power with China, if China's not prepared to share power with the United States, I don't see how you do avoid the escalation of strategic competition. So we can test how serious are people? How seriously do people allow their rational economic interest to shape their approach to this issue? Well, the fact is, not at all. Nobody is talking about sharing power. If they really believed that they had to manage their way through this, they would be looking more actively for these kinds of solutions. So I think the data suggests that there's a serious risk that, notwithstanding their very strong interest, the very strong interest we all have in not allowing strategic competition to get in the way of economic advantage, states, leaders, voters are perfectly capable of making dreadful mistakes. So let me finish by saying a few things about what all this means for Australia. The best outcome for Australia by far would be the continuation of American uncontested primacy, just as we've enjoyed it for the last 40 years, forever. That would be a terrific outcome for Australia. I just think it's completely incompatible with China continuing to grow economically. So the question is, what's the next best alternative? In new circumstances, I do think the shared power model I've articulated is the best outcome for Australia by far. It avoids Chinese hegemony. It keeps the US engaged. It keeps the US engaged in circumstances which it is possible for us, more than possible for us, to maintain a very strong alliance with the United States. It's different, but it's still very strong. and it avoids escalating strategic competition and all the risks that they bring with it. Now, maybe there are some better models, and I'm waiting to hear them. People who don't like my model are very welcome to throw theirs on the table. But I think for Australia, that shared model is the best we have on offer. So what do? I think Australia should urge the United States to share power with China, not to compete strategically and not to withdraw. This is a very radical idea. Australia has regarded the maintenance of primacy by our Anglo-Saxon allies, first Britain then America, in the Western Pacific as the fundamental plank of our international posture since Arthur Phillip waded ashore at Sydney Cove in 1788. It would be a very new idea for us. It would also require a very different kind of diplomacy in Washington. We don't normally have that kind of conversation in Washington, but we need to have it. Before we have it in Washington, though, we need to have it here. Because for Australia to have any influence in the way America thinks about these things, and I think we can, at least I think we should try, we won't have much influence unless whoever goes to do the speaking for us clearly comes with a lot of support from Australia. So we need to have this debate here at home first, and it's not easy. It's not an easy debate. Having observed the way some people have responded to my quarterly essay, I can see how uneasy this debate is going to be. It does raise very sensitive issues. It does get under people's skin, and I understand that. It will be a very brave politician who picks it up and runs with it. There'd be a very brave politician who says, actually, well, maybe we do have to think carefully about what's happening in Asia and what that means for the future of the alliance and how we think the United States should play its role. And maybe we should go to Washington and talk to America about this. But unless China stops growing, somebody will have to do it. And just to sort of emphasise that, it's worth just spending a half a minute thinking about what happens if the US doesn't take our advice. Either the US withdraws, as I said, in which case we lose the alliance, or as the US starts to compete more intensively with China, there are two possibilities. Either we stick with the United States as it gets drawn more and more deeply into strategic competition with China, which means we get drawn more and more deeply into strategic competition with China. That alliance starts looking completely different from the alliance we've had in the last 40 years. It will cost us much more. It will pose much greater risks to us. And there will be real question as to whether or not it would be worth it. Whether in the end the benefits to that alliance to us would be worth what it would cost us. Because it's one thing to align with the United States to resist Chinese hegemony, to stop China becoming an overlord. It'd be quite another to accept the risks of strategic competition and the cost of strategic competition with China just to avoid treating China as an equal. Would that be so bad? I don't think it would be nearly as bad as what I think the strategic competition might look like. And of course, if that's true, then we'd walk away from the alliance. Those are the circumstances in which I think we would abandon the alliance, or at least might. That question will be on the agenda. And I'm here to tell you that would be a terrible choice, because the options for Australia without an alliance with the United States are not very attractive. I spend a few pages in the essay unpacking them, and it's very hard to look at any of them and think, boy, that looks fun. Just reminds you how good the alliance is when you look what the alternatives are. Which is why it is so important to do all we can to sustain the US alliance in the Asian century, which means we must do all we can to ensure that America's role in Asia works for Asia and works for us. So if Julia Gillard really wants the alliance to last, she'd better rethink it. I would offer her this text. It comes from Kevin Rudd, his speech at the beginning of the 2020 summit. I don't want to have to explain to my kids, and perhaps their kids too, that we failed to act, that we avoided the tough decisions, that we failed to prepare Australia for its future challenges. We can either take command of the future, or we can sit back and allow the future to take command of us. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you very much. Any questions, comments, dissent, abuse? Yes.
I know nothing about the field. but how is it that the alliance works for us? It seems to me that our alliance works for America. Every time they crook their fingers, we go running.
It's true, and I'm sympathetic to the view that the alliance doesn't do much for us. But the reason why I take the contrary view is twofold. The first is I do think we kind of take for granted what the US alliance delivers to us, and in particular what US presence in Asia does to us. The argument I make for the alliance is that our relationship with the United States helps to support America's presence in the Western Pacific, and America's presence in the Western Pacific has helped to keep the Western Pacific peaceful. Now that is hard to see because the Western Pacific has been so peaceful for so long. You know, you don't notice the structure in your roof day after day because the roof just holds up till it blows off. And then you think, oh, okay, there was a whole lot of stuff up there that was quite important. I do think the US presence in Asia has been very important, really fundamental to Australia's security, and I think it has both reduced the kinds of strategic risks we might face and reduced what we've had to do to face the ones that we might face. And I think the price we've paid for that has been very low. Now, it never looks low, it never feels low. It's hard to say it's low today when there are 22 Australians killed in Afghanistan. But for most of the time since the Vietnam War, in fact, until we started taking casualties in Afghanistan, Australia carried one of the lightest alliance burdens of any of America's allies. Compare what Japan does for its alliance with the United States. I mean, $7 billion a year host nation support and having whatever the number is, 30,000. Some of my students should know the answer. Anyway, 30,000 US service personnel on their territory. And, you know, very, very onerous social issues that go with that and all the rest of it. Think what the Koreans pay. Think what the NATO allies in Europe pay. What do we pay? We've got a couple of one joint facility now, and we turn up in the Middle East every so often. That's about it. It's actually pretty light. So I tend to think that for us the balance of cost and benefit of the alliance has been very good. But that's what I fear will shift. The model that people have of the US alliance in future, those who can't imagine us ever walking away from the alliance are really saying they can't imagine walking away from an alliance that works as sweetly for us as it has for the last 40 years. My point is, if it keeps working that sweetly, I wouldn't walk away from it either. But the kind of alliance, the kind of obligations it would impose on us in a more contested Asia would be much, much more demanding. It'd feel more like being a European ally during the Cold War. And I mean, you can be a bit specific about that. The more strategic competition between the US and China intensified, the further the United States would press Australia, if we remained an ally of the United States, to, for example, have very substantial US forces based in Australia, base substantial Australian forces overseas with American forces, Australian forces based on Guam, for example. We would be pressed to expand our own capabilities very significantly. And we will be pressed to have a much more explicit, probably even automatic commitment to support the United States in the event of a conflict. It would feel more like being a NATO ally of the United States during the Cold War in Europe. And that's something that I think Australians really find it hard to imagine just how different that would be. Okay. Yes. Robert. Sorry. Robert first, then you.
I think that's a compelling and persuasive argument about the sort of future we may well face. Just a couple of variables I'd like to introduce. One is if you assign a greater probability to the arguments, or greater weight to the arguments about economic engagement, end of ideology, that may increase the probability of some sort of accommodation akin to your concept argument. That then may also affect your judgments about the kinds of responses that Australian leaders should make now and in the future. The other variable would go to even accepting the broad outlines of your argument, which I do, and I think it's even a forward-looking politician would judge that it's still some years before I have to actively and explicitly and overtly make these kinds of decisions.
Yeah. Now, two very good points, Robert. Look, the first one we had a long debate on the Lowy Interpreter blog about this issue a few months ago. How far does economic integration constrain strategic competition? And of course it does to some extent, no doubt about it. No doubt about it. It raises the costs of strategic competition, it raises the incentives to avoid it, no doubt about that. The question is, does it raise them enough to lower the risk of escalating strategic competition, enough for us not to worry very much about it? And I don't think it does. And the reason for that is that I don't actually think in the end people, and by people I mean statesmen and leaders, but also publics and voters, really see these two things on the same sheet of paper. There's a phrase that Tom Friedman of the New York Times used, the Golden Straitjacket, to describe this phenomenon, that we're all in a golden straitjacket. We can't compete strategically because we're all bound up by our economic interdependence. But my problem with the Golden Straitjacket hypothesis is, as far as I can see, everybody thinks the other guy's wearing it. So when I talk to Americans, and I talk to Americans a lot about this, I say, I'm really worried about escalating strategic competition with China. I say, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. Look, the Chinese can't afford to do that. I mean, they'd be mad to do it. And then when I talk to Chinese, they say, don't worry about it. The Americans would be mad to do that. They can't afford to. And I say, yeah, but that's what they think the other way round. The fact is, both believe that compromise will be necessary in order to maintain a cooperative economic relationship, and that compromise will happen. But they both believe the other guys will do the compromising. And when you say to them, okay, what does that compromise look like? When you say to Americans, do you want to continue to have a very strong economic relationship with China? Yes. Are you prepared to compromise your strategic position with China in order to achieve that? No. Are you prepared to treat China as an equal in order to achieve that? No. I've never had an American, I mean this literally, I've never had an American in a sort of focused discussion on this issue say to me, yes, we're prepared to shift and treat China as an equal. So what does it mean to say we're prepared to compromise if you're not actually prepared to do what's required? And none of that's to say that I don't think the economics and economic interdependence is important. What worries me is that people use it to dismiss the risk, which actually increases the risk. If you approach the issue with a high level of confidence that because we all trade like mad we couldn't possibly compete strategically, you won't make the steps, you won't make the compromises that are necessary in order to ensure that the economic interaction can continue. So in a sense, the confidence actually makes it harder to compromise and therefore makes escalating strategic competition more likely. And the reason for that brings me to your second point, is that of course this is not an easy issue to handle. Politicians will avoid it if they can. It's very comfortable for politicians to say, look, we don't have to worry about reshaping the strategic order in Asia because it will look after itself, because we're all trading so much that we'll never be dumb enough to compete. And one of the reasons they find that attractive is that it is hard for politicians to address this issue. And your question is, how long don't they have a bit of time up their sleeve? My answer is, I don't think they do. And there are two reasons for that. Because this can go bad fast or slow. It can go bad fast at any time. At any time there is a risk that a stupid incident between, shall we take an example at random, fishing boats in the East China Sea, could escalate from a little spat to a bigger spat to a bigger spat to something really hard to control. And you've got to be very careful not to overlive the historical metaphors here, but there is something a little bit Sarajevo about this risk. And once it starts, of course, it's incredibly hard to stop. So there is, in a sense, a sort of a flaw in the regional order. The whole, it's sort of like a tear in your tyre. You're driving around on this tyre, there is a hole in it. It could blow actually at any time. It's not a bad idea to change the tyre. But there's also it could also go bad slowly. That is that step by step, bit by bit, a more adversarial relationship evolves. I think we can actually already see that process underway. And the reason why it's worth acting sooner rather than later to stop it is that the further you go down that track, the harder it is to turn back. The more you get drawn into a competitive relationship, the harder it is to say, no, that's the wrong thing to do. Let's try sharing instead. Because you've already invested a whole lot of rhetoric and politics and anger, actually, in that competitive relationship. So if you're going to try and go for the sharing deal, share fast. My last point is, of course, that time is not on America's side, because the later this is deferred, the more powerful China will be, the better its negotiating position will be, and all great powers are equal, but some great powers are more equal than others. The harder it will be to build the kind of order that would actually suit us best. So all the incentives from a policy point of view are to go fast. But I absolutely agree. All the incentives from a political point of view is to leave this till next time, which brings me back to Kevin Rudd's quote. Okay, so yeah.
Hugh, I was wondering whether extrapolation of that idea of strategic competition, not contest between the US and China, what are the implications for our immediate region in Southeast Asia of that? Because my impression is China has acquired much more influence and economic power and aid in those areas.
Yeah, look, it's a terrifically good question, and there's a whole different bit of this that relates to, I've focused on Australia, but there's a whole regional part to this. Let me just touch on it very briefly. It seems to me that with the important exception of Japan is in a very special category of its own, but with the important exception of Japan, I think every other country in Asia is roughly speaking in the same position as us. We don't want to live in China's orbit. We do want to be able to work with China and benefit from its growing power and growing wealth. But we don't want to live in China's orbit, so we do want the United States to stay engaged. On the other hand, we don't want the United States to stay engaged on the basis of trying to preserve its primacy, if that is going to draw it into a kind of strategic competition with China, which is going to make it hard for us to trade with China and disturb the region all round. So all of us, I think, have a shared interest in the United States staying engaged on the kind of model I'm talking about. Now, I think a lot of Americans, and quite a bit of the commentary here in Australia, presupposes that countries in Asia actually are willing to support the United States in direct strategic competition with China. But I don't think that's right. I think for them, as for us, it's the calculus I mentioned before. If China shows itself determined to try and dominate the region in a hard hegemonic way, then we will line up and support the United States. And that will be a great tragedy, a huge mistake on China's part. But the more intriguing possibility is that Chinese do accept that they can't do that doesn't make sense for them. They are prepared to accept, if they are prepared to accept a position of equality. If the United States nonetheless pursues strategic competition against China because it's not prepared to accept equality, all of us in Asia will face the choice, do we support the United States just because the United States doesn't want to accept equality with China? And I think the answer for them as for us is no. If that's right, then there is a very important part of the diplomacy, is that we don't go to Washington by ourselves to say, why don't you share power with China? We go, literally or figuratively, with Indonesia and Singapore and probably South Korea. And in a way, India. I think India's interest in this are very strongly aligned. Japan is the exception. Japan is in a very difficult position, but that's another story. John.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what you say here. I think, though, in rejecting the idea of strategic competition, you might have defined the concept a little too narrowly. After all, if your strategic objective is a concept of power, isn't the United States going to have to compete for it? So aren't you looking to play into your strengths? Because it's obvious that the Americans are not going to be able to bankrupt the Chinese militarily the way that Ronald Reagan did the United States. I think that's your point about economic growth.
Yes.
But on the other hand, China's not without its own vulnerabilities. It's dependent on the rest of the world for resources, for markets.
Yep.
It has huge domestic problems. It has no natural allies. And first and foremost, it doesn't have a soft power model that anyone really wants to buy. So isn't that where we should be competing strategically?
Well, I think there are two issues there. The first is that certainly it's a mistake to overestimate China's power. There's a lot of respects in which the United States still has huge advantages over China, including the soft power aspect and in some aspects of its military capacity. But I'm also struck by the asymmetry of the competition, because in the end, my model of what China wants to do is very Asia-focused. I don't think China really, at least not in the timeframes we're talking about here, not for the next few decades. It doesn't want to emulate American global power. It wants to emulate America's power in Asia. And in the end, Asia is probably the most useful place to try and dominate anyway, as it's so much the centre of exciting developments this century. Now, and in Asia, I don't think China has to equal America on a whole lot of dimensions of power because it's there, and America has to project power into it in all kinds of ways. So I think there's an inherent asymmetry about it. But it's not at all to deny the point that America continues to have a lot of advantages. As I said, it's no part of my thesis is not a story about American decline, except relatively. America will remain a fantastically strong, powerful, innovative, resilient country. I'm actually quite bullish about America. I just think that in the end, 1.2 billion people beats 330 million people in raw economic output once they're, roughly speaking, playing on the same paddock. The point about competing in a concert, it's a good point. A concert is not a tea party. I don't mean that in a contemporary Republican sense. I mean, it's not quite as nice as I may be making it out to be. This is a very strategic set of relationships, a set of relationships which says we countries, we great powers, will all agree that all of us are better off not trying to dominate any of the others because we all understand that if any of us try to dominate the rest, the others will unite against us and beat us cold. So it's got to have a very hard strategic element at its core. Now, I do think that one of the reasons why I think America's role in Asia is so important in this is that America's presence in that concert is one of the things that makes it absolutely unambiguous to China that it can't, that calculation is going to impose a real discipline on the way China exercises its power. If it's only Japan and India, then though I think they're very significant strategically, it's not quite the same without Uncle Sam. But I do think that because of the asymmetries in the situation, I don't think America has so much power that it can successfully compel China to accept less than a position of equality. That would be the maintenance of the status quo. And I think the fact is that as China's power grows, and it's not as multidimensional as American power, but I don't think we should presume that that's static. I think China is developing, it's not just growing its GDP, there are a whole lot of other things happening, including some elements of soft power. So I don't think we should be complacent about where the soft power balance looks 20 years from now or even 10 years from now. So overall, whilst having a very strong respect for how much America will still bring to the table, I don't think it's going to bring enough to the table to be able to achieve more than that concert kind of deal. But the good news is I don't think it needs to achieve more than that in order to build a reasonably stable Asia. Okay, I better.
Fierce agreement on that last point.
I better make this. I better make this the last one. I'll take the one in the corner. Sorry.
Thanks, Hugh. I just wanted to ask your opinions on whether or not. I mean, I can see all of this making a lot of rational sense in the political context in all three of the countries. How likely do you think that this is going to be that someone's actually going to be able to sell this in the United States, China, and Australia? Say this is the way that we
look. It's a good question, and it's a very good question. Because it gets right back to where I started from. That is, what do we expect of our politicians? And I'll make two observations. The first is that this is a big one for us. This is not just another day in the office of the Department of Foreign Affairs or even the Department of Prime Ministers. This is a very big transition for us. But it's not completely unprecedented. In the late 19th century, this country, having grown under the delightful protection of the Royal Navy for 100 years, started to recognise that British power was waning and started worrying about it a lot. And both because Britain was facing huge challenges in Europe from Germany and Russia, and to a certain extent from France, and of course in Asia from Japan. And you look back at the history, and one of the things that's striking is how well the politicians of the time responded to it. It was a very tough call. This was Britain in high imperial mode, and Australia in high imperial mode. It took a lot of chutzpah not a phrase they probably would have used, to stand up in front of Australians and say, look, you know, Britannia rules the waves and all the rest of it, but they might not forever. So we have to start thinking very carefully about what they do if we don't. And they did a couple of very innovative things. One of them was federation. I mean, Australia, federation was all sorts of things, but more than anything else, it was an active strategic policy, a direct response to the changing strategic balance, which saw the diminution of the primacy of our principal protector. A second time that we got it roughly right was at the end of the Second World War, when we had this fantastically turbulent transformation of our strategic environment. World War II itself was a big deal, but after the Second World War, with decolonisation, with the emergence of independent states where we'd previously lived in a region of empires, all of a sudden we were dealing with independent states. We had much more complex relations with Asia. We had the whole question of nuclear power, nuclear weapons came onto the picture. We had China re-emerging as a unitary state and a potential great power at least. This was a fantastically vivid transformation of our strategic environment, and we transformed the way we did foreign policy. In fact, we built ourselves a foreign policy, almost from the ground up, in response to this set of changes. We also built a national university, actually, on the basis of it, at the risk of giving my institution a plug. And that was a bipartisan thing, actually, in both cases. Both of those examples, people from both sides of politics contributed to that. There's a lot of effort and a lot of Chifley in that process, but there's also a lot of Percy Spender in particular, and a bit of Casey, and maybe a bit of Menzies. So, you know, it's twice in our history we have faced really big strategic transformations, and our political culture has been good enough to deliver it. Now, whether that will happen this time round, I'm not sure. But I will make this observation, that in business in general, you never get better service than you demand. And we'll never get better service from our politicians than we demand from them. Thank you very much.